three virgin sisters, one Apache warrior, and a decision that altered every life. The wind whispered softly through the sparse trees, carrying the scent of sagebrush and the faint aroma of wildflowers that stubbornly grew in patches of earth where water sometimes lingered. In this quiet corner of the frontier, life moved slowly, shaped by the rhythms of nature and the work of survival. Here lived a family whose story was about to change in ways they could never imagine. At the heart of this story were three sisters, Eliza, Margaret, and Clara. They were known throughout their small settlement for their gentle nature and bright minds. Eliza, the eldest, was 17. She had a calm and thoughtful demeanor, always considering the feelings of others before her own. Margaret, at 15, was spirited and curious, often wandering farther than she should, eager to see what lay beyond the hills. Clara, the youngest at 13, had a quiet strength. She observed the world carefully, noticing small details that others often missed. Together, they formed a bond that was unshakable, a sisterhood rooted in love and shared experience. Their father, Samuel, was a man of simple values. He had worked hard all his life, carving a living from the stubborn land that many would have deemed impossible to farm. He was strict, but his rules were guided by love. He wanted his daughters to be safe, to grow up with the kind of moral strength that could help them navigate the dangers of a world that was often unforgiving. Their mother had passed away years ago, leaving the girls with memories of warmth, laughter, and the gentle guidance that only a mother can give. Still, the sisters carried her lessons in their hearts, in the way they tended to their chores, the way they cared for each other, and in the kindness they showed to every creature that crossed their path. The mornings were always busy. Eliza often helped her father with the animals, checking the horses and feeding the chickens, while Margaret and Clara attended to the garden and prepared the small kitchen for the day. Despite the work, the sisters always found small moments of joy. Margaret loved to chase butterflies and collect wildflowers, weaving them into small bouquets that she left around the house. Clara would sometimes watch the sunrise with a quiet smile, thinking about the stories her mother used to tell, tales of courage and adventure. And Eliza, patient and steady, would quietly hum old songs as she worked, filling the air with a gentle melody that seemed to make the hard labor feel lighter. Life in the frontier was not without its challenges. The settlement was small, with only a few families scattered across the dry plains. Supplies were limited and every decision mattered. Yet there was a rhythm to life here, one that the sisters knew well. They rose with the sun, worked with dedication, and rested when the day allowed. Neighbors helped one another when needed, sharing what little they had and watching each other's backs. Still, an undercurrent of tension always lingered. Stories of Apache warriors traveling through the region had reached their town, whispered around campfires, and discussed in hushed voices at the general store. These stories carried fear as well as respect, for a people whose bravery and skill in the harsh landscape were well known. The sisters had heard these stories many times, though they had never seen any Apache themselves. At first, they were frightened by the thought of strangers crossing into their land. Margaret often asked if they would ever meet someone like that, and Eliza would reassure her, though her own heart sometimes tightened at the thought. Clara, ever observant, wondered what kind of people could live so freely in the wide deserts and mountains. Each sister had her own thoughts, her own imagination filling in the gaps that stories could not explain. One particular morning, the family noticed something unusual. As Eliza guided the horses out to pasture, she saw a figure moving slowly along the edge of the settlement. At first, she thought it was a traveler seeking food or shelter, but as the figure came closer, she realized it was different from the usual settlers. The person moved with a quiet confidence, and there was something striking about the way he carried himself, even in apparent fatigue. His clothing was unlike anything they had seen, and there was a calm intensity in his eyes that made her pause. Eliza called her sisters quietly, and together they watched the stranger from a distance. Margaret's curiosity bubbled over. "Who do you think he is?" she whispered, her eyes wide with excitement. Clara, usually so cautious, felt a strange mixture of fear and fascination. The man seemed alone, yet he carried himself as though he belonged to the land, as if he understood it in a way the settlers never could. Samuel, their father, soon noticed the figure too. His face tightened with concern, and he motioned for the girls to return inside. "We don't know who he is," he said, his voice firm. "It could be dangerous. Stay away from him." But even as he spoke, he could not ignore the slight limp in the man's walk, the signs of someone who might be in need of help rather than harm. The day passed with careful observation. The man did not approach the house, but he stayed nearby, sometimes resting in the shade of a distant tree, sometimes moving slowly along the outskirts of their land. The sisters could not stop thinking about him. Margaret wondered if he was lost, Clara considered whether he might be hurt, and Eliza felt a pull she could not explain, a sense that their lives were about to intersect with someone extraordinary. As evening approached, Samuel made a decision that would shape everything to come. He instructed the girls to prepare food and blankets in case the stranger needed aid. It was a dangerous choice, one that could bring the ire of neighbors or worse, yet Samuel's instincts told him that this man was not a threat. The sisters worked quietly, their hearts pounding with a mix of fear and excitement. The thought of breaking bread with a stranger, especially one so different from them, both thrilled and terrified them. When the man finally approached, it was clear that he was exhausted. His clothes were dusty, his skin tanned and marked by the harsh sun, and his eyes carried the weight of long days traveling alone. Yet, there was a dignity in the way he stood, and a gentleness that surprised the sisters. Eliza stepped forward cautiously, offering him food and water. Margaret watched eagerly, while Clara remained near the doorway, her eyes never leaving him. The man accepted their help with quiet gratitude, nodding respectfully and speaking only a few words. His language was different, his accent unfamiliar, but they understood enough to know he was not there to harm them. Samuel observed carefully, ready to intervene if necessary, but he felt a strange sense of relief. Perhaps, he thought, this encounter could teach his daughters something important about courage, about compassion, and about the unpredictability of life. That night, the family gathered around the fire. The stranger sat near the edge, not imposing but part of their circle nonetheless. The sisters watched him, noticing the small details, the way he tended the fire, the careful way he ate, the quiet respect in his gestures. In those moments, the world outside seemed to fade, leaving only the fragile connection forming between them. And so, the quiet life of the three sisters, shaped by routine and the rhythms of the frontier, began to shift. The arrival of the lone stranger brought uncertainty, yes, but also the first glimmer of something extraordinary. Their days of simple work and small joys were not over, but they would never be quite the same again. The sisters would soon learn that courage and compassion often appear in unexpected forms, and that every decision, no matter how small, can alter the course of a life forever. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, the sisters sat together, hearts both anxious and hopeful. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly, indifferent to human worries, yet filled with hidden possibilities. Somewhere beyond the hills, the future waited, shaped by choices yet to be made, by bonds yet to form, and by a stranger whose presence would change everything. The quiet life before the storm had ended, and a new story had begun. The morning after the stranger's arrival, the sisters awoke to a world that felt slightly different, though the sun still rose over the rugged hills in the same golden light. The air smelled of dust and sage, but it also carried a strange sense of expectation, as if the land itself knew that their lives were about to change. Eliza, Margaret, and Clara rose early, each lost in her own thoughts. None spoke much at breakfast, though their eyes often met in quiet acknowledgement of the unusual visitor who had spent the night in their home. Eliza helped her father check the animals, as she always did. The horses stamped their hooves and nickered softly, unaware of the tension in the family. Margaret wandered toward the garden, her fingers brushing the leaves of the plants, while Clara watched the sunrise from the doorway, noticing the first rays catching on the dusty fence posts. The sisters could feel a quiet pull toward the stranger, a mixture of fear, curiosity, and something they could not yet name. The stranger, now more composed, had moved slightly closer to the house by the morning, as if testing the boundaries of this new and unfamiliar place. His movements were careful, deliberate, and even in his quiet presence, there was a sense of strength and alertness. He had the kind of calm that comes from someone used to surviving in harsh conditions, someone whose life had been shaped by the desert, the mountains, and the constant need to be aware of danger. Samuel, their father, remained cautious. He had spent years teaching his daughters to respect the unknown, to treat strangers with care but not to trust blindly. Still, he could see that this man posed no immediate threat. There was something honorable about the way he spoke, the way he accepted their food, and the way he tended to the fire and the few simple belongings he carried. Samuel decided to allow a careful closeness, while warning his daughters to remain vigilant. Over the next few days, the sisters observed the stranger as he rested and recovered. They noticed small details that revealed his character. He treated every creature with care, feeding a sparrow that had fallen from its nest, gently lifting a stray kitten away from danger, and carefully tending to the plants that lined the family's small garden. There was a dignity to his movements and a quiet patience in his eyes. The sisters found themselves drawn to him, fascinated by the contrast between the world they knew and the life he must have led outside the settlement. Margaret, with her insatiable curiosity, was the first to approach him directly, offering fresh water and asking, as best she could, simple questions about where he had come from. He answered with short, precise words, his accent unfamiliar but understandable. His speech was calm and measured, and though he did not speak much, each word carried a weight of honesty and experience. The girls could see that he was not only a stranger in body, but a man shaped by a life very different from their own. Clara observed silently from a distance, noticing how the sisters' actions affected their father. Samuel, while stern and cautious, was learning to trust his daughter's instincts. He saw how Eliza led with care, how Margaret's curiosity opened doors, and how Clara's quiet observation often caught details others missed. Together, the family was navigating a delicate balance, welcoming a stranger without letting fear rule their choices. The days passed, and slowly bonds began to form. The stranger shared little of his personal story, but the sisters could see it in his actions. He had been traveling alone for a long time, surviving hardships that the sisters could hardly imagine. He had skill in hunting, knowledge of the land, and a quiet wisdom that spoke of both experience and resilience. He also carried himself with a moral code that the sisters instinctively respected. Every decision he made was measured and deliberate, showing respect for their home and their rules. Despite the growing familiarity, tension remained. The sisters were acutely aware of the rumors surrounding Apache warriors. Stories of raids, battles, and survival in the harsh frontier made them cautious. They had been raised to fear the unknown, yet their daily interactions with this man challenged every assumption they had ever held. He was not an invader or a threat. He was a person, one who, by chance or fate, had come to their doorstep needing help. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson, Margaret asked the stranger a question that had been on all their minds. "Why are you here all alone? she asked softly, her voice barely above the whisper of the wind. The stranger looked at her, his eyes steady and calm. He did not speak immediately, but after a moment he replied in careful words, explaining that he had been traveling through the land, seeking a safe path back to his people after an injury had slowed him down. His voice carried honesty, and even though it was different from what they were used to, it rang true. Eliza felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. Here was a man who had survived alone in the wilderness, who had endured hardship, yet he showed no aggression. Clara, who often read the world in small gestures, noticed the respect in his eyes whenever he looked at them. It was not fear he felt for them, nor superiority, but something more difficult to define, an understanding that they were all human, navigating life's challenges in their own ways. The stranger's presence began to subtly change the household. The sisters were no longer content to simply follow their routines. They discussed their day with more enthusiasm, shared stories around the fire, and noticed small joys in the world that they had overlooked. Margaret would laugh more freely, chasing butterflies in the garden as if the world had suddenly grown larger. Clara would pause to admire the colors of the sunset, while Eliza would quietly hum old songs, their voices mingling with the crackle of the fire. Even Samuel found himself smiling more, appreciating the resilience and empathy of his daughters. Yet, danger was never far. The settlement was small, and people noticed unusual activity. Neighbors occasionally glanced toward the family's home with suspicion, wondering why a stranger had been allowed near the house. Samuel knew that word could spread quickly, and with it, trouble. He cautioned his daughters, reminding them to be careful, to not draw attention, and to respect the boundaries of the stranger's stay. But even as he spoke, he understood that they had already formed a bond that could not be undone. One morning, the stranger needed to move closer to the water source beyond their property. The sisters decided to accompany him, a decision that would test their courage. They walked beside him along the narrow, rocky path, listening to the wind in the trees and the distant calls of birds. The landscape was harsh, yet beautiful, with endless stretches of earth, jagged hills, and patches of greenery where water had gathered. Every step was a lesson in patience and observation. Margaret's curiosity led her to ask questions about the plants and animals, while Clara noted the signs of animals that had passed this way before. The stranger answered with care, sharing knowledge about the land that only someone who had lived in it could know. By the time they returned home, the sisters had begun to see the warrior not as a stranger but as someone remarkable, someone whose life was intertwined with theirs in a way they did not yet fully understand. They realized that courage was not just about facing physical danger. It was about empathy, understanding, and making choices that sometimes went against fear or expectation. The warrior's quiet strength had taught them this lesson, and they carried it with them in the days that followed. That night, as the family sat together, the sisters reflected on the changes that had begun. Their hearts were filled with a mixture of fear, curiosity, and respect. They knew that the presence of the stranger had brought them to a turning point, one that would alter their lives forever. Outside, the desert remained vast and silent, yet within the small home, a connection had formed, a bond that transcended language, culture, and circumstance. The three sisters had learned that sometimes the most extraordinary experiences arrive when least expected, and that every encounter carries the potential to teach, transform, and inspire. The quiet of the night held them in its embrace, and for the first time the sisters felt the weight of the world beyond their home. Their lives, once simple and predictable, were no longer the same. The stranger's presence had awakened something within them, a sense of bravery, curiosity, and compassion that would guide their choices in the days to come. And though the future was uncertain, one thing was clear: their journey had begun, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. Days turned into weeks, and the presence of the warrior began to feel less like a disruption and more like a quiet, steady force in the sisters' lives. The early fear that had accompanied his arrival was slowly replaced by curiosity, respect, and a growing sense of connection. The sisters learned more about him with each passing day, observing his habits, listening to the stories he shared about life in the wide lands beyond their settlement, and noticing the patience and care in every small gesture. Eliza often spent hours near the horses, learning from the warrior as he demonstrated ways to care for animals, track movements across the land, and recognize signs of approaching weather. He had lived much of his life in the wilderness, and his knowledge was practical, precise, and rooted in experience. Eliza admired his skill and the quiet confidence with which he moved through the world. It was unlike anything she had ever seen, a strength not born of pride, but of necessity, discipline, and respect for life itself. Margaret, with her natural curiosity, asked countless questions. She wanted to know about the plants he used for medicine, how he found water in dry places, and the ways he observed animals to predict what might come next. The warrior answered her patiently, never condescending, always encouraging her to notice the world around her. Margaret's fascination grew into admiration. She began to understand that bravery was not only about facing danger, but also about knowledge, observation, and being attuned to one's surroundings. Clara, though quieter, watched closely. She noticed the small ways in which he respected the family, the care he took when handling their possessions, the way he refrained from speaking unless necessary, and the subtle gestures that showed gratitude for even the smallest kindness. Clara began to understand that courage and integrity often went hand in hand, that strength could be quiet, and that respect was a choice made in every action, not just in grand gestures. Despite the growing trust within the household, the outside world remained a threat. Neighbors whispered about the stranger's presence, speculating about his identity and intentions. Samuel remained vigilant, aware that the settlement was a small, tight-knit community where gossip spread quickly. He warned the sisters to be careful, to act naturally, and not to attract unnecessary attention. The warrior, too, seemed aware of the delicate situation, maintaining distance when necessary and showing respect for boundaries, even as he grew closer in quiet, meaningful ways. The sisters began to see beyond the stories they had been told about outsiders and danger. They realized that the warrior was not the embodiment of fear, but a human being with his own struggles, feelings, and values. His life had been shaped by challenges they could hardly imagine, days of walking through harsh deserts, nights spent under open skies, and the constant need to survive. Yet, in every action he took within their home, there was respect, patience, and an unexpected gentleness. This realization transformed their understanding of courage and morality. One afternoon, the warrior took the sisters to a small stream a few miles from the homestead. It was hidden among rocks and trees, a place that few in the settlement knew existed. The journey was challenging, with steep paths and uneven ground, yet the sisters felt safe with him leading the way. Along the path, he pointed out edible plants, explained how to read signs in nature, and shared lessons about observing without disturbing. It was more than a walk, it was a learning experience, a glimpse into a life they could never have imagined. As they rested by the water, Margaret could not hide her admiration. "You know so much," she said softly. "How did you learn all of this?" The warrior smiled faintly. "By living," he replied simply, "by paying attention, by listening to the land, to animals, to people. Life teaches those who watch carefully." The sisters absorbed his words, feeling the weight of his experience and the truth in his gentle wisdom. Back at the homestead, the family's daily life continued, but the warrior's presence had altered its rhythm. The sisters were more thoughtful, more attentive, and more aware of the subtle beauty in their surroundings. Even Samuel noticed the change. seeing how his daughters had grown in courage and understanding. He had always taught them the value of hard work and integrity, but now they were learning lessons that went beyond chores and routines, lessons of empathy, trust, and the complexity of human character. Despite the deepening bond, the situation was not without tension. The whispers in the settlement grew louder. Some neighbors had noticed the warrior's presence and began asking questions. Samuel knew that sooner or later someone would demand answers. The sisters understood the risk as well. They had formed a connection with the warrior, but they also knew that loyalty could come with consequences. The awareness of danger heightened their sense of responsibility, reminding them that courage was not only about feelings, but also about choices and actions. One evening, the warrior shared a story of his past, a tale of hardship and survival that revealed his resilience. He spoke of long journeys across deserts, of relying on instincts and knowledge to find water, and of facing dangers alone. The sisters listened in silence, absorbing every word. It was a story of courage, perseverance, and the quiet determination that had shaped him into the man they now knew. Margaret felt a swell of admiration, Eliza felt respect for his wisdom, and Clara felt the reassurance that courage could come in many forms. Over time, small gestures began to speak volumes. The warrior would help the sisters with chores, lifting heavy buckets of water, guiding them in the fields, and teaching them skills that would be valuable for the future. Each act was performed with respect and consideration, never imposing, always encouraging. The sisters responded in kind, offering him food, tending to his wounds, and including him in their family routines. Through these interactions, a subtle but profound bond formed, one built on trust, respect, and mutual care. Yet the reality of the settlement remained. Samuel knew that the longer the warrior stayed, the greater the risk. Gossip could turn to anger, and curiosity could turn to suspicion. He reminded the sisters to remain cautious, but also recognized that they were learning important lessons about empathy and morality. The warrior's presence had become a quiet catalyst, showing them that doing what is right often requires bravery, patience, and understanding. As the days continued, the sisters began to reflect on their own feelings. They realized that admiration for the warrior was intertwined with respect and curiosity. They were learning about the complexities of human relationships, about trust and integrity, and about the courage required to act with compassion in a world filled with fear. Each sister experienced these lessons in her own way, deepening her understanding of herself and the world around her. By the end of the third week, the bond between the sisters and the warrior was undeniable. They had shared knowledge, experiences, and moments of quiet reflection that created a connection far deeper than words could express. The warrior had become part of their lives, not as a stranger, but as someone who challenged their assumptions, expanded their understanding, and inspired them to grow. The sisters also noticed subtle changes within themselves. Eliza felt more confident in her ability to make decisions. Margaret's curiosity had grown into a thoughtful understanding of the world, and Clara's quiet observation had become a source of insight and strength. They began to understand that courage was not simply the absence of fear, but the willingness to face uncertainty with compassion and integrity. As night fell over the frontier, the family gathered around the fire once more. The warrior sat quietly, sharing small observations about the stars, the wind, and the sounds of the desert. The sisters listened intently, realizing that life was full of lessons if one only paid attention. The outside world remained uncertain, and danger was never far, but within the circle of the firelight, they had found trust, understanding, and a sense of connection that would shape their lives forever. The quiet life they had known before the warrior's arrival was gone, replaced by a new rhythm of learning, discovery, and shared experience. The sisters were no longer simply observers of the world. They were participants, learners, and, in their own ways, protectors of someone who had become a part of their lives. And though they did not yet know what challenges the future would bring, they were prepared, strengthened by the lessons of courage, respect, and compassion they had learned together. In this part of their journey, the sisters realized a truth that would remain with them forever. Bonds formed through understanding, empathy, and shared experience are some of the strongest in life. The warrior had shown them that trust and respect could overcome fear, that courage came in many forms, and that every choice, small or great, could shape the course of their lives in ways they could never imagine. The days that followed were filled with a strange mix of calm and tension. The sisters had grown comfortable with the warrior's presence, yet they could not ignore the whispers that floated through the settlement. People had begun to notice the stranger's unusual habits and the family's quiet protection of him. Gossip spread quickly, as it always did in a small community, and soon, curious glances and quiet murmurs began to turn into questions that Samuel could not easily answer. Samuel knew that their situation was becoming more dangerous. One afternoon, a neighbor approached the edge of their property, pretending to ask about chores but really trying to catch a glimpse of the stranger. The neighbor's sharp eyes searched the homestead, and Samuel could feel the weight of suspicion pressing down on them. He called his daughters together and spoke in a low, serious voice. "You must be careful," he said. "People are watching. They may not understand what we are doing and they might act before thinking. Protect yourselves and protect him, but stay calm. Nothing reckless." The sisters understood the gravity of their father's words. For weeks, they had learned to observe, to listen, and to act with patience. But now the stakes were higher. Margaret, usually full of questions and excitement, found herself thinking carefully before speaking. Eliza became more vigilant, checking the boundaries of their home and watching the paths that led to the property. Clara, always observant, noticed the small changes in their neighbors' behavior, the way they paused when passing the house, the hushed tones of conversation, the glances that lingered a little too long. Despite the growing tension, the bond between the sisters and the warrior deepened. They had come to rely on his presence, and he, in turn, had grown accustomed to theirs. He shared stories of his past, teaching them lessons that went beyond survival, lessons about patience, observation, and understanding human nature. He taught them how to notice small signs of danger, how to read the wind and the land, and how to make careful decisions even when fear threatened to take over. The sisters absorbed every word, recognizing that these teachings were preparing them for challenges they could not yet imagine. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills and the sky turned a deep shade of red, the sense of danger became undeniable. A group of settlers arrived at the edge of their property, led by a man whose expression was a mixture of suspicion and anger. He had heard rumors and was determined to confront the family about the stranger. Samuel stepped forward, trying to maintain calm, but he could feel his heart pounding. The sisters watched silently, understanding that the moment had come when they would be tested. The settlers demanded answers. Who was the stranger? Why was he here? Samuel answered carefully, explaining that he had found the man injured and had only sought to help him. The explanation was met with skepticism. The settlers' voices grew louder, and the tension in the air thickened. The sisters could feel the fear rising, but they also sensed the quiet strength of the warrior nearby. He did not speak yet, but his presence was commanding, his eyes steady, his posture calm. It was a reminder that courage did not always come in words, and that sometimes the strongest defense was patience and integrity. As the confrontation continued, the sisters realized that a critical decision had to be made. They could not allow the warrior to be taken by the settlers, but they also could not provoke a fight that might endanger their family. The choice before them was clear but difficult: protect him at all costs, or surrender him and hope that it would be enough to keep their family safe. Each sister felt the weight of this decision pressing on her heart. Margaret's usual enthusiasm was replaced by careful thought. Eliza's calm demeanor carried the weight of responsibility, and Clara's quiet strength became a source of steady resolve. Finally, the sisters spoke together, their voices calm but firm. "We will protect him," Eliza said. Margaret and Clara nodded in agreement. The warrior, standing nearby, looked at them with quiet understanding. There was no surprise in his eyes, only a deep respect for the courage they had shown. It was a moment of clarity. The sisters had made a choice not only to protect someone else, but also to stand by their values, even when fear threatened to dominate. The family quickly devised a plan. They could not stay in the settlement while the tension continued to rise. The warrior would need to leave, to return to his people, and the sisters and their father would help him make the journey safely. It was a dangerous path, but it was guided by careful planning, knowledge of the land, and the quiet bravery that had grown within the sisters over the past weeks. Every detail mattered: the timing, the route, the small supplies that would sustain them along the way. That night, under a sky full of stars, the sisters prepared. They gathered food, blankets, and water, packing lightly to move quickly. The warrior inspected the supplies, nodding in approval at their careful preparation. Margaret felt a thrill of excitement mixed with fear. Eliza's mind raced through every possible scenario, and Clara silently checked every detail, ensuring nothing was overlooked. Samuel, though anxious, trusted in their preparation and in the courage his daughters had shown. The journey began in the early hours, before the sun had fully risen. The sisters and their father led the warrior quietly away from the settlement, moving through the rugged landscape with care and attention. Every sound of the wind, every shift in the shadows, was noted and interpreted. The path was difficult, with uneven ground, steep slopes, and obstacles that required patience and teamwork. Yet the family moved with determination, guided by the lessons they had learned from each other and from the warrior himself. Along the way, the sisters saw the beauty of the land in a new light. The desert was harsh, yes, but it was also alive with color and life. Margaret marveled at the way the sunlight reflected off the stones. Eliza noticed the patterns of plants that survived in the toughest conditions, and Clara observed the small tracks of animals, understanding their stories from the signs they left behind. The journey was more than a test of courage. It was a lesson in observation, patience, and respect for the world around them. After several hours, they reached a small clearing near a stream. The warrior paused, looking back at the sisters and their father. There was a quiet intensity in his eyes, a mix of gratitude and understanding. "You have shown courage beyond what many could imagine," he said softly. "Your choices today will be remembered." The sisters felt a swell of pride, tempered by the awareness that their journey was not yet complete. They had acted bravely, but danger was still near, and careful thought was required until the warrior was safely beyond the reach of those who might harm him. As they prepared to say goodbye, the sisters felt a mixture of relief, sadness, and respect. They had come to care deeply for the warrior, and he had become more than a visitor in their lives. He had become a teacher, a guide, and a symbol of bravery and integrity. Margaret's voice trembled slightly as she wished him well. Eliza offered a quiet nod of encouragement, and Clara's eyes held the steady calm that had guided them through so many moments of uncertainty. The warrior set off into the distance, moving quickly and silently, guided by the knowledge of the land and the careful planning of the family. The sisters watched until he disappeared from view, their hearts filled with a mixture of relief and longing. Samuel spoke softly, acknowledging the courage and wisdom his daughters had shown. "You have all acted with honor," he said. "Remember this night, and remember the lessons it has taught you. Courage is not always loud, and bravery is not always easy, but it is always worthwhile." As the family returned to their home, the settlement seemed quieter, though the tension in the air lingered. The sisters carried the memory of the warrior with them, the lessons he had taught, the courage he had inspired, and the bond that had formed over weeks of shared experience. They had faced fear, made difficult choices, and acted with integrity, and in doing so had changed themselves forever. The night fell over the frontier, and the stars shone brightly above. The sisters sat together, reflecting on the events of the day. They understood that life would continue to challenge them, that danger and uncertainty were part of the world they lived in, but they also knew that they had discovered a strength within themselves that could guide them through anything. The decision they had made, to protect the warrior, to act with courage and compassion, was a turning point, one that would shape the rest of their lives. And so, the quiet life they had once known was transformed. They had faced fear and uncertainty, made a brave choice, and acted with integrity, leaving a mark not only on the warrior's life but also on their own. They had learned that every decision matters, that empathy and courage can change the course of lives, and that the bonds formed through trust and shared experience are some of the strongest and most enduring. The days after the warrior had left were quieter than the sisters had expected, but they were filled with reflection, growth, and a deep sense of change. The once simple rhythms of their life had shifted. Their chores continued, the animals still needed tending, and the fields required care, but everything felt different now. The sisters moved through their day with a new awareness of themselves, of one another, and of the strength that comes from courage and compassion. Eliza, the eldest, noticed how much she had changed. Before the warrior's arrival, she had been cautious, careful to follow rules and avoid mistakes. Now, she found herself thinking more freely, considering possibilities and making decisions with confidence. She understood that courage was not always about physical bravery, but about standing by what was right, even when it was difficult or uncertain. She helped her father more willingly, guided her younger sisters with patience, and approached life with a quiet but steady determination. Margaret, who had always been curious and eager to explore, felt a sense of purpose she had not known before. Her adventures with the warrior, walking through the hills, learning about the land, observing animals and plants, had taught her to see the world with new eyes. She understood the value of patience and thoughtfulness, and she began to combine her curiosity with careful observation. Margaret found joy in small moments, appreciating details that she had previously overlooked, and she carried a sense of wonder that was now balanced with understanding. Clara, the youngest, had discovered her own strength. She had always been quiet and observant, but the experiences of the past weeks had given her confidence in her insights and instincts. She noticed small changes in the natural world, predicted outcomes based on careful observation, and felt the power of thoughtfulness and discernment. Clara realized that courage was not loud or showy. It could be quiet, steady, and deeply impactful. Her sense of responsibility and care had grown, shaping her into someone who could face challenges with a calm and steady heart. The warrior's departure had left a silence in their home, but it was not an emptiness. His presence had imprinted lessons, values, and memories that would remain with them forever. Samuel noticed the changes in his daughters, too. He saw their confidence, their compassion, and their growing understanding of the complexities of human character. He realized that, in helping the warrior, they had all learned more than survival skills. They had learned the power of empathy, trust, and moral courage. Life slowly returned to a sense of normalcy, but the sisters carried the memory of the warrior in everything they did. Each task, each walk through the fields, each quiet moment by the fire reminded them of the lessons they had learned. That fear could be faced with calm determination, that compassion could guide difficult decisions, and that even small acts of courage could create lasting change. They shared stories of the journey with one another, recounting moments that had seemed small at the time but were now clear in their significance. The settlement, too, seemed to sense a subtle change. Neighbors who had once whispered began to notice the quiet strength and integrity of the sisters. Samuel's family had faced a challenge without faltering, and their actions had earned a quiet respect in the community. People observed the sisters' calmness, their careful decision-making, and their courage, understanding that true strength often manifests in ways that are not immediately obvious. The family's example became a quiet inspiration, showing that kindness, bravery, and integrity were qualities that could ripple outward, affecting not just individuals but entire communities. Months passed, and the sisters continued to grow, shaped by the lessons of the past weeks. Eliza took on more responsibility in the household, guiding her sisters and helping her father manage their daily life. Margaret's curiosity evolved into a thoughtful appreciation of the world around her, as she applied the knowledge she had gained to better understand the land, animals, and people. Clara's quiet strength became a source of guidance for her family, as she learned to trust her instincts and observations, helping others make careful decisions. Together, the three sisters moved forward with a sense of confidence and purpose that had been hard-won through experience. Though the warrior was no longer with them, he had left a lasting impression. The sisters often thought of him, wondering how he had fared on his journey back to his people. They imagined him walking through the rugged terrain, relying on his knowledge and skills, and carrying with him the memory of their courage and kindness. In return, they knew that he carried their lessons with him, remembering the care and compassion they had shown, the trust they had placed in him, and the bravery they had demonstrated in difficult circumstances. The story of their time with the warrior became a quiet part of family memory. The sisters did not speak of it loudly or boast of their courage. Instead, they carried it in their hearts, letting it guide their actions, shape their choices, and strengthen their character. They understood that the experiences of life, especially those that test courage, empathy, and moral integrity, remain with a person long after the events themselves have passed. Every challenge they faced afterward was informed by the lessons learned from the warrior, to act with care, to trust their judgment, and to face the unknown with strength and compassion. As the seasons changed, the sisters noticed the land in new ways. They saw patterns in the growth of plants, the tracks of animals, and the signs of weather. They understood the importance of patience and observation, the value of learning from experience, and the necessity of respecting both nature and human life. The lessons of the past weeks had become part of their character, shaping the way they interacted with the world and with each other. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills and the sky turned to shades of purple and gold, the sisters sat together on the porch, reflecting on all that had happened. They spoke quietly, sharing memories of the warrior, recalling moments of courage, and recognizing the ways they had grown. "I never thought I could be this brave," Margaret said softly. "I never realized how much courage we can find in ourselves." Eliza nodded, feeling a deep sense of pride and understanding. Clara smiled quietly, knowing that her own inner strength had been awakened in ways she had never imagined. Samuel joined them, his eyes filled with pride. "You have all learned what many people never understand," he said. "Courage, kindness, and wisdom are more important than strength alone. You have shown that bravery is not just about fighting. It is about making the right choice, even when it is hard, and acting with integrity no matter the risk." The sisters listened, feeling the truth of his words settle in their hearts. Life continued as it always does, but the sisters knew they were changed. The warrior had come into their lives for a brief time, yet the impact of his presence was enduring. They had faced fear, made difficult decisions, and acted with courage and compassion. In doing so, they had learned valuable lessons about themselves, about humanity, and about the world beyond their small settlement. The quiet strength they had gained would guide them in all that was to come, shaping their choices, relationships, and understanding of life itself. The story ends not with dramatic events, but with the quiet confidence of three sisters who had faced the unknown and emerged stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. They had learned that courage comes in many forms, that trust and empathy can overcome fear, and that every decision, no matter how small, can shape the course of a life. The memory of the warrior and the lessons they had shared would remain with them forever, a reminder of the power of kindness, bravery, and the enduring bonds of human connection. As the night fell and the stars shone above the frontier, the sisters knew that their lives would never be quite the same. They had faced a moment that had tested them in ways they could not have imagined, and they had passed the test with integrity and courage. The future remained uncertain, as it always does, but they were ready to meet it, guided by the lessons of the past and the strength they had found within themselves.